Hi everyone, we're in Philippians 4 this morning, so it'd be helpful if you've got that passage in front of you, if you can follow along with us as we come to our conclusion of our mini-series in Philippians. Now I want to ask as we begin, how do you cope with pressure? How do you cope with trials and worries and anxiety? We all respond differently, don't we? For some people, it eats away at them in their minds, in their hearts. They sort of think about it a lot. They sort of stew over it. For others, they don't do that, but it sort of sometimes erupts out of them, perhaps attacking somebody innocent as a result of the sort of pressure that they're under. We all respond differently. Now, the Philippian church were under pressure. They were under pressure partly through internal stuff that was going on in their church, but also through some of the external false teachers. We saw in chapter 3 some of the false teachers who were insisting on obedience to the Old Testament law. Circumcision, dogs, Paul calls them, mutilators of the flesh. They were being attacked. They had opponents. Paul refers to them in 1:28. He says, don't be frightened of them. But they were under pressure, and you could be forgiven. They could be forgiven for worrying, for being anxious about stuff. And yet Paul says, as he concludes the letter to the Philippians in chapter 4, he draws a number of the themes together, themes of gospel unity, of working together. He draws those things together, and in chapter 4, verse 1, he says, stand firm. Stand firm. Stand fast in the gospel. So the question is, amongst all the pressures of life, how can we stand firm? And Paul, in Philippians 4, gives us two reasons why we can stand firm in the face of pressure and opposition. The first reason is that we have partnership in the gospel. We have partnership in the gospel. Look down at verse 2. Paul says, I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel. We don't know exactly what the issue was here, but Paul appeals for unity in the church. These two women have had a falling out, and he wants them to be reconciled. He wants them to be partnering together in the gospel, to have unity. This is a theme that we've seen a number of times. In 1:27, Paul says that we are to be striving together with one mind for the sake of the gospel. In chapter 2, he revisited that in quite some detail, saying that we're to be like-minded with one another, having the same mindset of Christ who went to serve others. Here in chapter 4, he deals with that issue again of church unity and applies it to a very specific issue, these two women falling out. It's important. Another reminder to us, the unity of God's people, the oneness, the partnership that we have is vital. It's absolutely vital. God has saved us to be one, saved us to be into community with each other and to be one body, to be a team. That's what makes it tragic when people fall out. Now just imagine the scene. You're in the Philippian church, you have your church service, perhaps it's one evening, on a Sunday evening, and it's dark, the candles sort of lighting up the room. It's the first century, and you're meeting in someone's house, maybe the Philippian jailer, or maybe it's Lydia's house, and you're all chatting, having your tea and coffee, and Lydia sort of calls you to attention. Guys, listen up. We've got somebody coming from prison with Paul's letter. Paul's written us a letter. It's called Philippians. And so this person's man or woman reads out this letter. And perhaps you're getting to the end of chapter 3 and, you've had a long day and perhaps you're just drifting slightly, your mind's just drifting to other things. I'm sure that's never happened to you in any sermon. But for some people it does happen. And you can imagine Euodia and Syntyche maybe just switching off slightly. Gets into chapter 4. And then they hear their names being mentioned from the front. You can imagine they'd be sitting up, wouldn't they? I don't know if that's ever happened to you. The preacher says your name. You're listening now. Perhaps everyone in the church turns round to look at them. And Paul is addressing two women who've fallen out. Now these two women, we don't know exactly what the issue was. Their names have been preserved for all of human history as the two women who fell out in the Philippian church. But Paul's not shaming them. He doesn't want to shame them. He wants to help them. After all, these have been co-workers in the gospel. Verse 3, they've contended at his side in the gospel. They are co-workers. They've been on the mission field. They've been in gospel work. They've been doing gospel ministry with Paul together. And that's what makes it particularly tragic that they've fallen out. And Paul says they are to be united. It's important that we partner together as one. Now, perhaps an early application from this sermon may be that as you've read these words, if you've thought about the importance of unity, that it's come to your mind that you've fallen out with somebody. Maybe somebody in our church. Perhaps a relationship has gone frosty. It's gone cold. Perhaps you've fallen out a long, long time ago, but you've never really received reconciliation with someone. This is a reminder to us. Perhaps God is putting this on your heart this morning to seek reconciliation, to seek unity with other Christians. And it may be that you need to make the first move, not to wait for somebody else to make the move to you. It's important as Christians that we make the first move of reconciliation. Perhaps that's something to be put on your mind this morning. One very practical application. Now, it may be that you need someone's help. That's why verse 3, Paul appeals to this person, my true companion, which is presumably an individual in the Philippian church who Paul wants to help these two women who have fallen out. Maybe this morning you need a third party, someone to help you to find reconciliation with another Christian. But the theme of partnering together is absolutely vital, and it's key for Philippians chapter 4. So look at 4 verse 10. Paul says, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. The Philippians were concerned about Paul. They partnered with him. Paul had planted the church over 10 years ago. Paul had moved on. He was going elsewhere in the world, doing his gospel work. And yet they had a concern for Paul. They were partnering with him. They had partnership with Paul. And that partnership resulted in sharing. Verse 14. It was good of you to share in my troubles. Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. They shared with Paul. They supported Paul financially. That's the context in 15, 16 and 17. They gave a financial gift to Paul. They supported his work to enable him to do gospel ministry. They wrote a check or sent it via PayPal or whatever the first century equivalent was. They supported him financially. They shared their money with him. That's how they partnered in the gospel. But they didn't just share their money, their cash. They shared their lives with Paul. They shared in Paul's troubles. Verse 14 again. It was good of you to share in my troubles. When Paul was in trouble, well, they shared that because they were invested in Paul. When he suffered, they suffered. When he rejoiced, they rejoiced. And that's why verse 1, Paul says that they are his joy and crown. Gospel ministry, gospel partnership is not just sending a check to support gospel work. It is to invest in people, to share ourselves, to have an investment in who people are. When Becca and I were working for UCCF, we had to raise a certain percentage of our salary from supporters. And God was always very kind and gracious and provided for us. And provided for us from people that we knew, but also from some people that we didn't really know we'd been in a church with perhaps many years earlier, but we weren't particularly close with them. And there was one particular older lady who gave to us month after month after month. She was very faithful in giving. Even when we left UCCF and went to go to Oak Hill and we had to raise even more money, she continued to give month after month after month. She was very faithful in giving. And that was amazing. And that was God's grace to us. But it wasn't just that. She didn't just write a check. She invested in us personally. She would send emails asking how the kids were doing. She would follow up on our prayer letters asking how the kids were settling into nursery or what our plans were after Oak Hill. She took an interest in us. She shared in our troubles. Now, I think there's a particular application for the way that we support mission partners as the church. It is important that we support them financially. They need to be able to buy groceries and pay bills, and you can't do that from just goodwill alone, can you? We need to support people financially, but more than just that, to invest in who people are. Gospel partnership is costly. Not just financially costly, but costly in terms of time, effort, our thinking, our hearts, our prayers. We are to invest in who people are in their lives. So, for example, it may be practically following up on someone that we support financially, maybe a mission partner or maybe somebody that you individually support, and to ask them how they're getting on. That visa application that you mentioned, how's that progressing? Or that doctor's appointment that you mentioned in the prayer letter, how did that go? Or how did the Bible study that you're doing with that new mum that you mentioned for us to pray about, well, how did that go? It's following up things, investing in who people are. So maybe a very practical thing from this passage, it may be that perhaps for one or two individuals or organisations that you want to invest more emotional energy in. Not necessarily more financial giving, but to spend more emotional capacity, to invest in who people are, to support and share in their troubles. After all, we are a team, united. We're a team. Our task as a church is to proclaim the gospel, to Cambran, Torvine, the ends of the earth. There are parts of Torvine that feel like the ends of the earth. Now, we're not all called to go out to the mission field, but we are all called to play our part. One of my favourite little quotes, favourite stories, is from the missionary William Carey, the great Baptist missionary to India. And he said to Andrew Fuller, he said, "I'll go into the pit if you hold the rope." I love that. He says, "I'll go into the pit, I'll go out, but you've got to hold the rope." And that's our task. We're not all called to go out into the mission field, but we're all called to hold the rope, to help them along, to play our part. Gospel partnership. We can stand firm amongst the pressures and the difficulties of life if we have one another, if we have unity as a church and we partner with people. Stand firm because we have partnership in the gospel. The second reason that we can stand firm is because we have peace from the gospel. We have peace from the gospel. Now remember, some of the issues in Philippi, we've said it a few times now, internal pressure, internal relational problems, also external things that were coming at them. There'll be a lot of reasons for them to worry. And God wants to help them and he wants to help us in our worries. Verse 4. "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." These are wonderful words. This is an invitation from God to present our worries to him. Verse 5, the Lord is near. Isn't that amazing? The Lord is near. He's in our hearts by the power of his Spirit, but he's near to us. He is a father to us, a father who cares for us, who loves us, who has compassion on us. He has come near to us and he invites us. He invites us to tell him what we're worried about. The stuff that we're thinking about, the stuff that we're sort of stewing over, that's eating away at our minds, perhaps the stuff we've never told anybody. Well, God knows it. Of course he does. He knows everything. So tell him. Pray about it. It says, every situation, by prayer and petition, present your request to God. It's an invitation to bring our worries, our concerns, our anxieties to God. But I missed a bit out, didn't I, of verse 6. It says, with thanksgiving. With thanksgiving. See, I think this is a key antidote to the problem of anxiety. It's to be thankful. It's to have thankfulness in our hearts. You see, we have so much to be thankful for when we stop and think about it. The gospel, every spiritual blessing in Christ, the physical material blessings that we have as well. Now, if you're anything like me, when you're feeling worried and anxious, though that thing that you're sort of worried about, it can eat away at you. It can become the thing that sort of the only thing that you think about. It's like the sort of dark clouds enveloping you, and that's all you've got. But being thankful is like the sort of the sunshine of the gospel, dispelling those dark clouds. It helps us to put things into perspective, but it also helps us to pray and to petition God, because as we're thankful for God's grace, as we're thankful for all that he's done, that spurs us on to want to pray more, doesn't it? As we remember his past grace, that's fuel for us to pray even more. Practicing thankfulness, being actively thankful for something, is a great antidote for anxiety. And if we do that, there's a promise. Verse 7, the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts. God promises to give us peace. Not necessarily to take away the problem. Our circumstances may be the same, but we can experience that peace, that inner sense of satisfaction in our hearts. And that's why Paul talks about contentment as we come towards a close. He says, verse 11, I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content in whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Now, verse 13 is probably one of the misused verses of Philippians. Paul's not saying I can do anything in the whole world through God. He says I can do all this, or all this contentment. He can be content through God. See, contentment is possible. I don't know what your situation is, but it's possible to be content in it. Paul says so. Paul was in jail. Now, it doesn't come automatically. Paul says he's learned the secret. That language of secret and learning implies that it has to be discovered over perhaps many years. And it comes through God. I can do all this through him. The Lord is near. We don't get it through our own thinking, our own minds, even our circumstances changing. It's through God. It's God's gift to us. That's why we need to come to him with our anxieties. It is possible to be content, to have that experience of joy, of peace in our hearts through the gospel. You see, God gives us another promise. The promise in verses 8 and 9, which is directly linked, I think, to anxiety. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, whatever is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And then the promise at the end of verse 9, and the God of peace will be with you. In verse 7 he said the peace of God, but now he says the God of peace will be with you. God himself, the Lord is near. God will be with you. How? Well, through thinking about things. Thinking about the gospel. See, when we're anxious, we think lots about the thing that we're anxious about. But Paul says, think about the gospel. Think about whatever is true and right and good. To be spiritually minded, as the Puritans would have said. And God himself will be with us. Thinking is really important. You probably knew that anyway, but thinking is important in Philippians is what I mean. 2 verse 2, be like-minded, it's about their mindset. 2 verse 5, have the same mindset. Even in chapter 3, 13, Paul says, I do not consider myself to have taken it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind. It's all about his thinking, what he's thinking about, what he's considering. In verse 19, he says of some of these false teachers, their mind is set on earthly things. They have earthly mindset. And here in 4 verse 8, he says, think about good things. Think about the gospel. A key antidote to anxiety is being thankful, practicing thankfulness, but also thinking rightly, thinking about the gospel. And so as we come to a close, as we finish our time in Philippians, let's think again about the grace of the gospel. Let's have in our minds as we come to a close, Christ who gave himself for us, who did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, held on to, but poured himself out for the sake of the gospel. Verse 7, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus.